The day I decided to disappear was still too sunny for what I was feeling. The whole world seemed to vibrate with life, while inside me there was only one burning question. If I lost everything, even my memory, would anyone still love me? The idea both frightened and attracted me in equal measure. Because, after giving so much, I no longer knew if what I received was love or convenience. It all began with silence. Not an ordinary silence, but the kind that arises between people who sleep in the same bed and no longer recognize each other. The kind of silence that has weight, smell, and form. His gaze changed first, cold, distant, as if I were a visitor who had stayed too long. The words came later, disguised as carelessness, tiredness. That's not what I meant. And I, as always, forgave. Until one day I realized I was forgiving alone. That's when the plan was born inside me, small, like a spark in the dark. I would pretend to have lost my memory. I would pretend to forget everything. His name, our promises, even our fights. And I would see, with my own eyes, who would truly stay by my side when I ceased to be useful. Who would care when love ceased to have a name and obligation. But no matter how much I prepared myself, I wasn't ready for what I discovered. Because the truth, when it comes, never arrives alone. It comes with scents, with faces, with memories that we can't return. And sometimes, the price of knowing the hearts of others is realizing how much our own has already been trampled on. I remember the hospital. The constant sound of the monitors. The sharp white of the walls. I opened my eyes and pretended not to recognize anyone. He was there, standing still, motionless, trying to smile, but the smile wouldn't reach his eyes. And, behind that mask of concern, there was something different. A relief that cut me more than any lie. How can someone seem so light when they believe you've forgotten who they are? It was at that moment that I understood the power of not being remembered. It was like watching my own life from the outside, as if I were sitting in the audience watching a poorly rehearsed play. The people around me revealed themselves without realizing it. Some showed pity, others, interest. But love, true love, that didn't appear right away. Sometimes, to see who truly loves us, we have to turn off the light. Because when darkness falls, only those with their own inner light remain. And I was about to discover who, among all of them, still shone for me. The game had begun. And this time, I would no longer be the woman who waited to be loved. I would be the woman who observes, who tests, who discovers. After all, who would truly love me if I stopped remembering who I was? The first day of my forgetfulness was the hardest. Pretending not to recognize the people who had been part of my life required almost superhuman calm. Each face that approached seemed like a cracked mirror. I saw fragments of who I was, but nothing fit together completely. He, my husband, sat beside me on the hospital bed with a rehearsed expression, as if he were playing the role of a worried man. His eyes didn't tremble, and that was precisely what hurt me, the serenity. How can someone seem so calm in the face of losing the person they love? The nurses came and went, whispering, looking at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity. One of them asked if I remembered anything at all. No, I replied, and felt something break inside me. Because, for the first time, I told the truth. I really didn't remember what it was like to be loved. In the following days, he returned several times, always with flowers. Red roses, like the ones he gave me on our first anniversary. I looked at them and remembered what came after, the thorns. The visits became predictable, like a ritual of someone doing something just to keep up appearances. He spoke to me as if I were a stranger, and perhaps that's what I was now, a woman without a past, but with eyes new enough to see what I had previously ignored. My daughter, on the other hand, took a long time to show up. When she did, she had the same guilty look in her eyes, the same look I'd seen so many times as she grew up and began to distance herself. She hugged me too quickly, like someone in a hurry to fulfill a duty. I closed my eyes and realized that her affection didn't come from her heart, but from obligation. And that hurt more than any forgetfulness. That's when I started to observe. Every gesture, every word spoken in front of me. The family gathered in my hospital room as if it were an audience at a sad performance. They talked about me as if I wasn't there. She doesn't even remember the will, I heard my brother-in-law whisper. That sentence struck me like a lightning bolt. In a second, I understood everything that was at stake. I hadn't lost my memory, but they seemed to have lost their shame. The subsequent visits were different. His smile, my daughter's concern, my brother-in-law's questions, everything carried a weight that I now knew how to decipher. With each lie, I smiled sweetly, pretending to believe. And with each smile I gave, fear grew in their eyes. Because, deep down, those who feign forgetfulness begin to see what was previously hidden. At night, when the hospital was silent, I thought about how ironic it was. Only when I pretended not to remember did I begin to understand how long I had been forgotten. And perhaps that's why so many people choose to stay here, following each revelation, because they know what it's like to live surrounded by people who only approach when there's something to gain. In the dark room, the sound of the monitors was the only thing that kept me company. With each beep, I thought about how to transform that pain into a plan. How to find out how far they would go when they thought I was just a shadow of what I once was. And, while the world slept, I decided that the woman who would wake up the next day would be different. Not the one who loved too much, but the one who would learn to watch love unfold on its own. After all, feigning forgetfulness isn't the same as being lost. Sometimes, it's just the quietest way to find the truth. And I knew there was still so much to discover, enough to change everything they thought they knew about me. The following morning, the sun streamed through the hospital blinds like a golden blade cutting through the white walls. I pretended to be asleep, but I heard every word spoken outside. Low, tense voices, and the unmistakable sound of papers being handled. It was the same tone of conversation that always appeared when the subject was money. Careful, almost respectful, but tainted with ulterior motives. I recognized my husband's voice, firm and calculated, and another I didn't expect to hear, my daughter's. If she doesn't remember, the lawyer won't be able to validate anything, he said. My heart tightened. She whispered back, "Better that way, Dad. The less she remembers, the better for us." For a moment, I forgot I was pretending. I felt my body wanting to react, my breathing quickening. Instinct screamed for justice, but reason held me back. The plan wasn't complete yet. I closed my eyes tightly and let the sound of betrayal echo until it became fuel. I was no longer a victim, I was a spy. An invisible woman within her own story. In the afternoon, when they came back into the room, I already knew what to do. The light was soft, almost welcoming, and yet everything seemed like a poorly lit theater. He approached with a careful smile, the kind of smile that tries to gauge how much he can lie without getting caught. "Are you feeling better today, my love?" he asked, adjusting the sheet with hands that seemed clean, but carried the weight of falsehood. I looked at him for a moment, pretending not to understand. "Love," I murmured. "Who are you?" His gaze wavered, just for a second, but enough for me to perceive the discomfort. He hadn't expected the role of loving husband to weigh so heavily on him. My daughter stood there, arms crossed, looking away. The silence between us was thick, almost palpable. She held her cell phone in her hands, and I saw, reflected on the screen, a message she had received. Did he make the transfer? I felt my blood run cold. It wasn't just disloyalty. It was theft. And I, the supposedly amnesiac woman, was the prize. In the following days, their visits became less frequent. Sometimes they sent flowers, other times, nothing. I began to walk the hospital corridors, observing. The nurses whispered, the doctors looked at me curiously, but I didn't care. Each step was a rehearsal for the woman I was about to become. One afternoon, a nurse dropped a medical chart on my bed. A careless mistake. Inside, I saw my name and a handwritten note, "Discharge expected. Family members request transfer of assets due to incapacity." That was enough. What had been pretense turned into conviction. I needed to continue the game, but now I would be the one dictating the rules. I asked to see the family lawyer. When he entered, he carried with him the smell of paper and secrecy. I feigned confusion, asking what transfer meant, what authorization signified. He explained, with forced patience, that it was merely a procedure to protect me. I nodded, looked him in the eye, and said in a weak voice, "Can I trust you?" He smiled, convinced. "Of course you can." But what he didn't know was that, the night before, I had left a message for my former secretary, a woman I had always treated like family, and who would now be my ally. She would receive all copies of documents signed from then on. What they called incompetence, I called a trap. The days dragged on, and my charade grew like a root beneath the earth. With each new gesture of false compassion, I mentally noted what needed to be used next. The way he smiled when he thought I wasn't watching. The way my daughter avoided touch. The way they both said goodbye, always looking at the clock, like someone counting down the time until the final reward. There was one particularly long night, when the hospital was utterly silent. The wind whipped against the window, and I felt surrounded by ghosts. I asked myself if I was still capable of loving those people, if the woman who believed in their goodness still existed within me. The answer came in the form of calm. I could forgive, but never forget. And in that instant, looking at the white ceiling and hearing the distant sound of the nurse's footsteps, I made a silent promise. They thought they were taking care of me, but in reality, they were revealing everything they needed to dig their own grave. And I, the patient, would wait for the right moment to return the memory they so feared, the one that would destroy every lie built upon my forgetfulness. The following morning, the sky seemed to have woken up with me, heavy, gray, laden with something about to fall. I was no longer pretending to be sick, I was pretending to be cured. I walked through the corridors with a light, almost serene smile, like someone who has nothing to hide. They believed me. And the more I smiled, the more confident they became. The doctor, the nurse, even the lawyer, they all saw in me a woman who had finally accepted her new life without memories. Little did they know that every step I took was calculated, that every distracted glance was a trap. That afternoon, I was discharged from the hospital. He came to pick me up. He was wearing a new shirt, an old cologne, and the same fake smile of someone trying to show he's still the man of the house. On the way back, the radio played soft music, and the silence between us seemed greater than the car itself. I looked out the window, feigning admiration for the streets, but I was observing his reflection in the glass. The way he gripped the steering wheel, tense, his restless gaze, his fingers tapping in rhythm with fear. That's how guilt behaves, restless, impatient, sweating under the guise of control. When we arrived home, the scent of lavender and a sense of distrust greeted me. Everything was exactly as before, yet different. The photos on the wall seemed to be watching me, and for a second I wanted to tear them down. But I restrained myself. The time for confrontation had not yet come. The house was now the perfect setting for the second act of my play. In the first few days, I observed his habits, his conversations, his schedules. He would leave early and return late, and each time he crossed the threshold, he carried with him the scent of a different perfume, sweet, cheap, persistent. I didn't need to feign shock. I simply let the silence speak. Because there are silences that scream louder than any scandal. My daughter, on the other hand, seemed to avoid the house. She said she was busy, but I knew she didn't want to see me. The weight of guilt made her hide behind routine. One day, I left a simple note on the kitchen table. Love doesn't fade with absence, it only reveals itself. I wanted to see if she still read what I wrote. When I returned, the paper was torn. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, I found myself wondering if I was going too far. If revenge would truly give me back what they took. But then I remembered every lie whispered softly, every careless gesture that hurt me, and the fire inside me would reignite. There are wounds that don't need healing, they need justice. I began to calmly organize the final plan. I reviewed every document, every piece of evidence, every word silently recorded. And as fate aligned in my favor, something curious happened. I realized that, even while pretending, I was in fact freeing myself. The woman they deceived no longer existed. I was someone else, more whole, more lucid. And it is at this point that many feel the impulse to support this journey, leaving a silent sign that the message touched them, because they know what it is to be reborn from within their own pain. One night, it rained heavily. The windows vibrated in the wind, and the sound of the raindrops on the roof seemed like a warning. He arrived late, soaked, carrying some excuse. The light flickered, the house was almost dark. When he entered the room, he found an envelope on the bed. Inside, a copy of the papers he had tried to sign in my name. And a short note, in the same handwriting he thought he had forgotten, "Memory may sleep, but it never dies." I stood in the hallway, watching him open the envelope. His face paled. For the first time in a long time, I saw fear in the eyes of someone who had always believed he was in control. The rain outside intensified, as if the sky also wanted to witness the scene. But it wasn't time to act yet. I let him sink slowly into doubt, guilt, and uncertainty about what was to come. The true punishment lies not in the immediate loss, but in waiting for the inevitable. And I wanted him to feel every second of it. I went back to the room, sat in front of the mirror, and saw my reflection smile. The face was the same, but the eyes already belonged to another woman. One who finally understood that sometimes you have to fade away to shine again. And the light that was now born didn't come from forgiveness or hatred, it came from truth. And the truth, once awakened, never sleeps again. That night, the sound of the rain faded until it was just a distant murmur, as if the whole world had decided to give me space to think. He slept on the sofa, his face still tense, his hands clenched as if trying to grasp the control he no longer had. I watched him in silence, and something inside me changed. It wasn't pity, nor anger. It was a strange lucidity, the exact perception that, when fear changes sides, the story also changes owners. I walked through the house without turning on the lights. I touched the walls, the objects, the portraits that now seemed like ghosts of a life that was no longer mine. With each step, I felt the lie they had built about me crumbling on its own, like old paint peeling. Feigning amnesia had taught me something no memory could show me: the power of observing love when it thinks it's not being seen. In the following days, the house became quieter than ever. He avoided looking at me. His presence was an absent sound, like a clock without hands. My daughter, after the torn note, began to reappear. She had a look divided between guilt and defensiveness. One day, she came into the kitchen while I was making coffee and asked, unable to look at me, "Mom, do you remember me?" I paused for a long time, let the steam rise between us, and replied, "Not everything that is forgotten is loss, sometimes it is protection." She remained still. I saw in her eyes the child I once was, the one who learned early on that silence can be both a weapon and a refuge. After that day, her visits became frequent. It was strange, almost poetic, to see how doubt can transform into care. She observed me, perhaps trying to decipher how much I truly remembered. And the more she looked at me, the more guilt began to erode what little security remained within her. I didn't need to accuse her. My own conscience did the work for me. Meanwhile, he tried to restore normalcy. Small gestures, rehearsed phrases, vague promises. But his body betrayed what his mouth tried to hide. Slower steps. Trembling hands. A gaze lost on invisible points. It was as if the weight of his own deception was beginning to bend his spine. The man who once thought himself invincible was now stumbling over his own lies. One morning, I found an old folder in his office. Inside were documents that confirmed what I already knew. The transfers, the contracts, everything signed during the days when I supposedly didn't remember anything. I carefully kept each paper. Not out of immediate revenge, but because the truth needs proof to be liberating. That night, I sat on the porch, watching the sleeping street. The streetlights cast long shadows on the wet ground. And for the first time, I felt something akin to peace. Not because everything was resolved, but because I no longer needed to chase after answers. They were coming to me, one by one, driven by the weight of the lie itself. But there was something that still troubled me: my daughter's gaze. Something about her told me that this plot wasn't just about greed. There was a story behind the story, a force that kept her silent. I began to wonder if she, too, had been manipulated, used as part of a bigger game. That same night, I woke to a noise coming from downstairs. Light footsteps, a muffled whisper. I stood there, listening. It wasn't him, the rhythm was different, hesitant, like that of someone carrying more guilt than fear. I went down slowly and found her there, my daughter, sitting at the table, with her folder open in front of her. When our eyes met, she was crying silently. She said nothing. She just stood there, holding one of the papers, her face wet. I approached slowly. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. For a moment, the woman she had become disappeared, and only the little girl who once asked me for comfort remained. I sat beside her. The ticking of the clock marked the time between us, the time that the lie had stolen. She finally managed to say something, between sobs. "I didn't know he would do that, Mom. I thought it was just a deal. I just wanted to help." The words came out broken, but they were true. I felt it. There was no defense, no excuse. Only regret. And, even though my blood still boiled, I realized that perhaps the revenge I had imagined wouldn't taste the same now. The greater punishment wasn't my plan. It was the weight they themselves were feeling. We stayed there, the two of us, in silence, until dawn. The sky was slowly brightening, and the light began to trace outlines on the living room floor. Her face, which had been tense before, now looked like that of someone who was finally ready to face what came next. But I knew the worst was yet to come. He still had no idea what I had discovered. And when the truth hit him, there would be no more disguise to protect him. The whole house seemed to be waiting for that moment, as if the walls also wanted to witness the outcome of a story that, for so long, had been written only in the shadows. Dawn entered the room like a shy visitor, first drawing clear lines on the floor, then invading the walls until it touched our faces, swollen from crying. My daughter slept leaning against the table, her hand still on the open folder, like someone protecting a wounded animal. I covered her shoulders with a shawl and walked slowly through the house, feeling every crack, every creak, as if the place itself breathed with me. The smell of coffee began to mingle with the chill of the early morning, and I realized that, however much the world was reorganizing itself outside, inside everything remained unsaid. The new light made the objects shine unfairly, too beautiful for what they held. I picked up an old photograph and saw my old smile, firm, confident, a little proud of having built so much with my own hands. I thought of the times I turned my face away to avoid turning offense into scandal. Of the times I took a deep breath when faced with a, "Calm down, it's not that big of a deal," said in that soft tone that hurts more than a shout. There were micro cracks in everything. In the wood of the table. In the glass of the frame. In me. She woke up startled, like someone returning from a nameless place. Her eyes sought mine and didn't need to ask permission. She came to me in one step. The hug was dry, but complete. There was no promise in the embrace. There was presence. And presence sometimes heals more than any explanation. We stayed like that, bodies still and hearts beating. Afterwards, we spoke little. Just enough to agree on the essential. The way back isn't made by running, it's made by seeing. When she went to take a shower, I opened the window and watched the street wake up. The newsstand vendor was arranging crooked stacks of paper on the counter, a bus spewed smoke, a boy with an oversized backpack waited for a ride. Everything the same, everything different. Fear and hope walked side by side inside me, like two stubborn children pushing each other in the back seat. For a few minutes, I felt light, a breath of relief at having heard the truth from my daughter. At other times, the tension returned, reminding me that that man still moved around this house like someone who must have something to hide, but believes that no one saw him. In the office, the curtains filtered the light in streaks of dust and gold. I placed the collected papers on the table, in order. There was a logic to the petty crimes, a recurring date, a name that appeared out of place, a value always broken down to seem smaller. I touched each sheet as one might stroke the mane of a skittish horse. I knew that one piece was still missing, the one that makes the castle crumble with elegance, without vulgar spectacle. Because it is not revenge that drives me. It is reckoning. It is returning each thing to the place where it should always have been. He woke up late. The sound of the shower in the suite was the first sign that the day had found its way to him. The smell of his old perfume followed, mixed with a cheap disinfectant that couldn't mask anything. When he appeared in the kitchen, his smile was like wet paper. He carried hallway chatter, hand in pocket, eyes that wouldn't stay still anywhere. I served the coffee and noticed a small detail. He couldn't stand silence, and yet nothing made me speak. Quietness disoriented him. The light on his face, that unforgiving morning light, showed what the domestic mirror chooses to hide. Tiredness in the corner of his eyes, an almost invisible contraction in his jaw, fear testing the garden fence. My daughter came downstairs with her hair tied back and the clear expression of someone who had decided to cross a bridge. I sat her down beside me. He sat on the other side. We formed a triangle, and the table became a field. She tried to say something, but he cut her off with a, "We'll talk later." His hand landed on my cup as if marking territory. I recoiled a millimeter. Sometimes that's all that separates dignity from submission, a millimeter. I didn't argue. I let his words spin in the air until they fell from exhaustion. Then I pushed the first copy of the documents, with my trembling signature, toward the center. I said nothing. I looked. There was a breathless second. He recognized what he saw, but found nowhere to hide his eyes. The light caught his face from the side and drew a shadow that wasn't from a lamp, it was from his own consciousness. My daughter took a deep breath, her whole body wanting to choose between staying and fleeing. I held her wrist under the table. A tiny gesture, a port built with fingers. He tried the careless version, then the protective one, then the loving one. I let them all pass without friction. Words that encounter no resistance get tangled up on their own. The discourse fell apart, piece by piece, until it became what it always was, a poor attempt to tame my intelligence. That's when I understood the magnitude of the loss and the gain. I wasted too much time waiting to be read with affection. I gained enough time to learn to write myself with precision. The afternoon drew to a close, and the house was divided into two atmospheres, the light streaming through the windows, which promised much, and the shadows in the corners, which reminded me that no promise is certain. I gathered up the folder, taped the flaps shut, and put it away in the high cupboard, where birthday parties and tablecloths once resided. Next to it, I left the space empty. I knew that soon something would need to fill that void, a decision, a name spoken in full, a silent goodbye. I walked down the hallway and saw, in the mirror, three versions of ourselves. The one we were, the one we are, and the one that awaits. The image trembled slightly, due to loose screws. I tightened them with my hand, but the vibration continued, coming from within. Sometimes, what needs tightening isn't the frame, it's the story. That night, before complete darkness, I went down to the balcony with a blanket. The street had grown cold, the neighbor from apartment 302 was singing softly, and the smell of freshly baked bread wafted across the block like a pleasant memory. My daughter sat at my feet, her head resting on my knee, as she did on feverish days. I gently stroked her hair, separating it strand by strand, and told her what wasn't written on paper, what we lose when we accept crumbs out of habit, what we gain when we return to our own throne, even if no one applauds. He didn't appear on the balcony. He locked himself in his room, locked it twice, rummaged through suitcases that led nowhere. I heard the zipper, the click of the safe, the sound of a glass hitting the sink. Each sound was proof without a photograph. The whole house knew. And yet, the house waited. Like someone holding their breath in the exact second before thunder. When the first stars pierced the sky, I felt the decision knocking at the door, but refusing the handle. The air carried the promise of a clean cut, clear, without wasting pain. I wasn't in a hurry. I'd learned that haste sometimes hands the gold to the thief. What I wanted wasn't spectacle, it was ritual. An end that honored the beginning. A passage that wouldn't break my daughter again. I closed my eyes and let the wind tell me what it knew. The fabric of the blanket brushed against my skin like fine sand. The streetlights cast long shadows on the trees, fingers of shadow trying to touch our window. The city breathed, and I breathed with it, with hope and fear, with gain and loss, with light and shadow. Inside, the phone rang once and stopped. A message was left for later, or never. I stood up, gestured to my daughter, and we went inside. In the hallway, the dim light was an invitation. At the end of the hallway, a closed door. Behind it, the low sound of a man repeating the same excuse to himself until he believed it. I touched the wood with my fingertips. I didn't push. I let the silence speak for us, almost everything. Almost. Because there was still the last thread to pull, the last piece to turn, the last second before, the one in which breath is held and the world understands that there is no turning back. The night remained dense, as if the air had decided to weigh down on everything that had not yet been said. The sound of his footsteps echoed softly in the hallway, restrained, calculated, the kind of movement of someone trying to convince themselves that they still have control over their own fate. I listened, motionless, each noise transforming into a clue. It was strange to realize that his fear no longer frightened me, it nourished me. Not like anger, but like certainty. The same certainty that is born when someone spends so much time being invisible and, suddenly, understands the value of being seen. Morning arrived, and with it the usual pretense. He greeted me with a hurried smile, asked if I wanted anything from the market, as if nothing were out of place. His face was a mask of normalcy hastily glued on. But something changed. Now, I saw everything from the inside. Every word sounded rehearsed. Every gesture seemed a silent plea for me to confirm the charade and let him continue. But no. The time for convenience was over. I went to his office and left an envelope on his desk. Inside, there was no evidence, no threatening notes. Just an old photo, the two of us, smiling in a time when love still seemed simple. And a line written in pen. Do you remember when the truth still lived here? It wasn't revenge. It was provocation. I wanted to see how long his silence would last before crumbling. The reaction came faster than I imagined. In the afternoon, I realized he was avoiding the house, inventing meetings, delays, short trips. His distance began to create a new order. The fear, once mine, now shifted address. It was like watching a castle crumble without having to touch the stones. And each of his gestures, each careful word, each fleeting glance, was a silent confession. My daughter, on the other hand, seemed lighter. The weight that once weighed her down now transformed into attentiveness. We started cooking together, laughing at small mistakes. Once, she observed me for a long time, her eyes moist and full of questions that still didn't dare to come out. I simply said, "Everything that is true falls back into place, even if it hurts." She nodded, and the silence between us became the kind of peace that time cannot erase. Gradually, I realized the house was breathing differently. The air seemed clearer, as if the truth, even unspoken, had opened the windows. The tension was still there, but transformed into expectation. Something was moving. A resolution was approaching. And I knew that when it came, it wouldn't need shouts or an audience. The truest justice is the one that happens the moment the other person understands that you no longer need to prove anything. One afternoon, while I was watering the plants on the balcony, I heard the sound of a car stopping out front. I recognized the engine before I looked. He got out, his suit rumpled, his eyes tired, a leather briefcase in his hand. There was something different about him, not the same confident man, but someone who knew the truth had caught up with him. He entered without knocking, and the sound of keys on the table was the announcement of a surrender. He looked at me with the same look he once used to ask for forgiveness, but now there was weariness, a weakness he wasn't feigning. He simply said, "I can't sleep anymore. I feel like you're watching me all the time." I smiled slightly. "I'm just remembering. That's what you always wanted, isn't it? For me to remember." He took a deep breath, as if swallowing his own poison. I felt, in that instant, that the role was complete. His truth was exposed, but without scandal, without spectacle. Just the exact weight of what had been done. After he went upstairs, I sat in the living room armchair and stared at the emptiness his confession had left. It was an almost beautiful absence. The revenge, which had previously seemed like fire, now appeared as water, cold, patient, molding everything around it without fanfare. The power lay not in destruction, but in knowing that, even if he tried to rebuild the lie, the foundations were already rotten. My daughter came downstairs and found me there, motionless. She asked if I was all right. I said yes. And I was, in a new way, the kind of peace that comes when pain understands it has served its purpose. I looked at her and, for a moment, saw a reflection of what was to come. Continuity, the chance to rebuild without inheriting ruin. The end was near, I felt it. But the end, I discovered, is never a fall. It's a mirror. It shows what each person has become after everything. I finally saw myself whole. And perhaps that's why so many, upon hearing this story, see a little of themselves in it. Because sometimes, all we need is a careful look to understand where the truth was all along, and to leave in the comments what it awakened in each of us. The house then fell silent. A good silence, full of meaning. The clock started ticking again, and, for the first time, I wasn't in a hurry. There was something sacred in that interval between what is lost and what one chooses to keep. And I knew that what would come next wouldn't be destruction, it would be rebirth. But before that, there was still one last reckoning to be made. And it would come with the calm of things that know their own worth. The following morning dawned with a different kind of silence, the kind of stillness that precedes a revelation. The sun filtered through the gaps in the curtain and streaked across the floor like a reminder that time continued, even when certainties wavered. The house seemed suspended between two worlds, the world of the crumbling lie and the world of the truth that had not yet assumed its complete form. He remained upstairs, locked up, pacing back and forth like an animal that realizes the cage was its own creation. I could hear the creaking of the floorboards beneath his uneven steps. Each slap was a voiceless confession. I descended the stairs carefully, my body light, but my heart on alert. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee and tasted of anticipation. I placed 2 cups on the table. One for me, the other for him, a simple gesture, but full of meaning. The sound of the hot liquid filling the porcelain was almost hypnotic. Sometimes, the everyday is the cruelest stage for the truth. It is there, between repeated gestures and common routines, that the disguise is completely torn apart. He descended slowly. His face pale, his beard unshaven, his eyes sunken. A man who had grown accustomed to controlling the plot and now didn't know what to do without the script. He sat down before me, in silence. I waited. He looked at the cup, didn't touch it. "What do you want me to say?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. I took a deep breath. Nothing. Sometimes, what is left unsaid says enough. His gaze wavered, and for a moment I saw the reflection of the man I loved. Lost, tired, too human to continue pretending. But compassion is dangerous territory. The same hand that extends forgiveness can be the one that reopens the wound. With every word he didn't say, I remembered what was taken from me, not the money nor the name, but the peace of believing in someone. Love, when it dies, doesn't disappear immediately. It rots little by little, and the stench of lies is what remains. My daughter entered the room at that moment, her hair loose, her gaze torn between fear and relief. She looked older, as if the last few hours had stolen years from her youth. She stood there, observing, and said only, "Dad, I saw what you showed him. I think he understands now." He looked up, and for the first time, I saw tears. They weren't many, nor sincere enough to heal, but enough to reveal that he had finally seen himself. The sound of the kettle on the stove broke the moment. I went over, turned off the heat, and watched the steam rise, as if the hot air carried away everything that hadn't yet been said. Sometimes, forgiveness is simply the moment we decide to let go of the weight. But letting go isn't forgetting. It's letting the pain find another place to live. In the days that followed, he left earlier, returned later. The routine seemed to try to disguise what had already been decided. I didn't ask where he was going. The house adapted to his absence as the body adapts to the lack of a limb that hurt too much to remain there. My daughter, little by little, also began to rediscover her laughter. Her sound echoed through the rooms as proof that hope doesn't die, it only falls asleep. One afternoon, I found an open letter on his desk, half written. The lines were shaky, but clear. "I don't know how to apologize without seeming small. I don't know if I deserve it." I read to the end of the page and realized there was no signature. The paper lay there, between emptiness and regret. I kept the letter in the drawer, not out of pity, but out of respect for what it represented. The belated awareness of a man who, at last, understood the damage he had caused. That night, I sat on the porch and let the wind tell me secrets. The sky was heavy, full of clouds that hid the stars. I smelled the damp earth, and an old memory came to mind. The day I got married, when the world still seemed simple and the future smelled of flowers. I closed my eyes and realized how much that woman in the white dress still existed within me, but now with scars that made her stronger. The door opened behind me. He appeared in the dim light, his face somewhere between shadow and light. "May I sit down?" he asked. I nodded without looking at him. We remained silent. The only sound moving was from the street. "Do you hate me?" he asked after a while. I thought of answering, but the words seemed too small. So I simply said, "I remember." He lowered his head, and the wind carried away the rest of the dialogue that was never spoken. We remained there, two people trapped in the same time, but on opposite sides of memory. The moon emerged from behind the clouds and illuminated the garden. Its pale glow made the leaves gleam like small truths. I understood, in that instant, that there was nothing left to prove. His punishment wasn't something I could do, it was what he would have to bear from now on. When I entered, the house was calm, almost alive. My daughter was asleep on the sofa, books scattered on the floor. The clock showed the same time as always, but time was different. I stood there for a moment, observing the space that had once suffocated me now seeming to breathe with me. And I realized that the true memory wasn't in the evidence I had gathered, but in the peace I had rediscovered. Dawn was approaching, and the whole house seemed to await the next move. Because the truth, even when it settles in, never settles. It continues to grow silently, illuminating what still needs to be revealed. And I knew there was something more waiting for me, a final fragment of a story that still needed to emerge from the shadows. That morning, the silence felt different. It wasn't the same as before, heavy and watchful. It was different, deep, clean, almost sacred. I walked barefoot through the house, listening to the soft sound of my footsteps on the cold floor. Every corner, every piece of furniture, seemed to have gained a new meaning. The living room, once the scene of muffled arguments, was now neutral territory, a space for waiting. The walls, which had already heard lies and pretenses, seemed to breathe along with me. There was something in the air that heralded an invisible turning point, like the exact moment when the tide begins to recede without anyone noticing. On the sofa, my daughter slept soundly, her face serene, her body relaxed, no more tension in her shoulders. The soft light of the lamp reflected on her hair, and, for a second, I saw her as she was when she was a child. Small, vulnerable, full of dreams that I believed I could protect from the world. I gently touched her hand, and she murmured something that sounded like, "Sorry," before falling back asleep. I smiled silently. Sometimes, forgiveness doesn't need to be said aloud. It happens in small acts of giving, in gestures that undo the weight of resentment. The wall clock showed 2:15. With each tick, I felt the past receding a little further. I went to the window and saw the garden illuminated by the moon. The damp leaves swayed slowly, and the wind carried the scent of living earth, the same scent from when I planted the first seedling in that yard, years ago. I remembered how he watched me from afar back then, saying that there was no time for flowers. And how, even so, I planted them. Now, the garden bloomed even after the storm. Perhaps love is this, that which survives when everything else collapses. I heard a faint noise coming from the hallway. His bedroom door opened. He came down slowly, with hesitant steps, like someone crossing a minefield. He was wearing the same clothes as the day before, but his gaze was different. There was a new weariness, a weight that seemed more spiritual than physical. He stopped in front of me, without saying anything. For a moment, time froze. I stared at him, and realized how much strangers we had become within the same house. "I don't know how to go on from here," he finally said. His voice was hoarse, his face tense. "You don't need to know," I replied. "What comes after the truth comes slowly." He nodded, his eyes welling up, and for a moment I thought of everything we had been, the dreams we had, the plans that never came to fruition, the affection that was lost between fear and ambition. There was a kind of silent mourning there, but also something akin to liberation. He turned and went to the door. He stopped, looked back, and simply said, "I'm going away for a while." I didn't ask where. I just let the absence begin to exist. When the door closed, the house let out a sigh. It was as if, finally, it too was free. I sat on the porch and waited for the day to dawn. The sky began to lighten slowly, tinging everything with blue and pink, like a scar that learns to be beautiful. The street awoke in silence. A puppy barked in the distance, a bird crossed the yard. And I stayed there, breathing in the new air that was forming between an end and a new beginning. I thought about everything I've learned these past few days. That truth has a price, but it also has a gift. It doesn't heal suddenly. It teaches you to live with what has been hurt until the pain transforms into strength. I remembered the times I diminished myself to fit into small spaces, the excuses I made for fear of being alone, the words swallowed to keep the peace. Now, I understood. The silence that once oppressed me was the same silence that now protects me. I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table. The sun was beginning to stream across the floor, drawing golden streaks between the chairs. I picked up a pen and a notebook. I started writing what I remembered, what I felt, what I could no longer keep inside. The words came out slowly, but firmly. Each line seemed to release a piece of my story. Writing was like breathing after being submerged for a long time. As I was writing, I heard light footsteps. It was my daughter, her eyes still sleepy. She approached, looked at me, and asked, "Is he gone?" I just shook my head. She sat down beside me, rested her head on my shoulder, and said, "Now it's just us, right?" I nodded, feeling the warmth of her presence as a comfort. "Yes, daughter. Just the two of us." But that was never a small thing. We stayed there, watching the sun rise, time unfold, and the silence transform into comfort. For a moment, I thought that perhaps life had always been this, an eternal rehearsal between losing and continuing. Light and shadow, guilt and new beginnings, memory and forgetting. Nothing truly ends, it only changes form. And I knew, with the calm of someone who had survived their own chaos, that there was still something to be discovered. One last piece, small, perhaps hidden in the most obvious place. The clock started showing the correct time again. And, as the sounds of day filled the house, I realized that a true new beginning doesn't start when someone leaves, but when we finally decide to stay, whole, present, awake. And yet, there was something in the air, something that told me the story wasn't over yet. The sun was already high when I closed my notebook and put my pen down on the table. Outside, the world went on as usual, but inside me something had changed definitively. It was strange to realize how silence can transform into companionship when pain finally finds its place. I looked around and saw the house bathed in a new light, the kind of light that comes not only from the sun, but from within. The same house that once seemed like a prison now breathed alongside me, free, spacious, alive. I walked to the living room mirror. For so long I had avoided it, afraid to face the reflection of who I had been. Now, I saw myself there with tranquility. The lines around my eyes told stories, not failures. The wrinkles were lines of survival. I touched the cold glass and realized, for the first time in years, I was no longer seeking anyone's gaze within it. I was enough for myself. My daughter appeared in the doorway, still with the light-hearted expression of someone who had rediscovered peace. He carried a cup of coffee in his hands, and that kind of smile that only appears after a storm. "Is it going to rain again?" he asked, looking at the dark sky forming. I laughed. "Maybe. But now I know that rain doesn't destroy anything, it only washes away what needs to be seen again." She sat beside me, and we watched the wind sway the curtains. The sound of them moving was almost music. I thought about how life has this strange ability to rebuild beauty in the same place where fear was born. And, within that simple instant, I realized that what I had been seeking all this time was not revenge. It was clarity. It was the courage to move on without needing to erase what had passed. His memory, now distant, no longer weighed heavily. He left without goodbyes, without letters, without grand promises. And, somehow, that was enough. His absence was no longer a void, it was a space where my new beginning finally fit. I learned that not every loss is punishment. Sometimes, it's liberation in disguise. I went to the garden. The flowers I had planted had withstood the previous night's wind. Dewdrops clung to the petals, and the scent of damp earth made me smile. Each color seemed more intense, each detail sharper, as if the world were returning to me the pieces I had once left behind. I took a deep breath and let the air slowly enter, filling what had once been empty. My daughter came closer and held my hand. "What do we do now?" she asked. I looked at the horizon and replied slowly, "Now we live. With truth. With calm." She nodded, and the silence between us was a promise of the future. I went back inside and looked in the mirror one more time. There was no more shadow in the reflection, only light. And there, in the discreet glow of the morning, I understood what had always been right in front of me. No one needs to feign amnesia to discover who truly loves them. Sometimes, all it takes is stopping forgetting about yourself. I closed the windows, let the wind out, and sat back down in the armchair. The clock on the wall showed 11:45. The same sound as always, but now with a different meaning. Time, that old enemy, had become my ally. It doesn't erase, it matures. And with it I learned that memory, however painful, is the map that leads us back to our own essence. As the day dawned, I felt the urge to record everything, not as a lament, but as a testament. The story of a woman who pretended to forget the world just to remember herself. The story of someone who discovered that love without respect is merely an illusion disguised as shelter. And that, when dignity awakens, no one can lull it to sleep. I picked up the notebook again and wrote the last line, "Remembering is my way of never getting lost again." I carefully closed the pages, as if closing a sacred cycle. The sound of the cover closing echoed through the house with the exact weight of an ending and the lightness of a new beginning. And if you've made it this far, if you've followed every beat of the story, it's because you also understand the power of starting over. Maybe I felt a reflection of myself at some point, a memory, a similar wound. If you felt it, then you already know, strength doesn't come from what we overcome, but from what we choose not to allow to break us. And that's why stories like this continue, because each person who recognizes themselves in them lights a point of light on the path. The rain finally began. Tiny drops pattering against the glass, as if the sky itself wanted to participate in the closing. I closed my eyes and let the sound envelop me. For the first time in a long time, the sound of the rain didn't bring sadness, it brought truth. And if these words touched you, leave a sign. Not for me, but for yourself. Because every story of liberation deserves to be witnessed. And mine, finally, was written with the only memory that matters, that of who I truly am.